the von der Hallmacht early writings and form, and since a text like L'auteur du péché, there is the constant critics of the interpretation of evil as nothing, because he said if you separate perfection and imperfection, you cannot find a solution of the question of evil, because there is, if evil is nothing in its ontological reality, there is no concurrence to it, and that's a real problem. So he wanted to find a solution of the problem of evil in, and I think the expression metaphysical evil, it's a way to challenge this bad interpretation. Well, what do you think of that?
Well, insofar as evil is, metaphysical evil is conceived as natural evil and malum alteri, I would agree with you that it has a positive ontological status. Insofar as it is creaturely limitation, I have argued that it is not. So this is my taking on this. And indeed, I think if it was the case that metaphysical evil as a creaturely limitation had a positive ontological status, well,
I think it cannot be nothing because of the question of physical concurrence. And so it's a way to resolve the problem of concurrence in this physical reality. And the critics, I think that there is a constant critics since the point on the way some theologians separate the perfection of the thing and its imperfection. And that's the example he said, the two pictures, the two paintings in L'auteur du péché, and or the musician that play at violin, but he is not responsible for the fact that there is dissonances.
yeah, but if you are taking a...
You cannot separate in the physical concurrence.
No, I agree that there is a sense of metaphysical evil in which it does have a positive ontological status. On that, I agree. Regarding the specific case of the Louis Bourget in that letter, I think that is a clear case of a due of a privatio, that is to say, of a due perfection which is lacking in a being which is supposed to have it. It's also interesting. I read the manuscript of the letter of Bourget to Leibniz, which is omitted in the Gerald edition because Gerald says, well, there is nothing interesting there. Indeed, there is something interesting because the objection that Bourget is raising is precisely the objection. We do not regard the difference in perceptions, in imperfections, that is to say perfections which certain creatures have and other creatures do not have, as evil, as a defect. And in fact, Leibniz answers back, putting aside that, no, this is not what I am talking about. I am talking about a perfection which is expected in a certain creature.
Last question.
Yeah, again, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I think my point is really primarily historical, and it concerns, well, let me just read what you say. This is on page 13 and 14. You write that instead of placing metaphysical evil in a Neoplatonic framework, the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is precisely the point at which Christian thought parts company with Neoplatonism and its doctrine of emanation, where progressive loss of goodness in being finally ends with matter conceived as total absence of goodness and therefore evil and non-being. I mean, just historically, it's the case that there are plenty of people who had a doctrine of creation ex nihilo, who also had a theory of emanation and embraced.
Who also had that?
Philo was.
No, who also had.
Oh, sorry. There are lots of people in the history of philosophy especially after Philo, Philo the Jew, so-called in medieval Europe, who had a view that God created the world ex nihilo, but then after the process of that creation was one of emanating the divine nature and the great chain of being fashion. And at least my understanding of a number of Renaissance philosophers is that people believe that. So I'm perfectly convinced that in the history of Platonism, it's perfectly possible to be someone who endorses or has a view that's consistent with Genesis. That was the point, and also has a view of emanation and the great chain of being. So I don't see the two as in conflict with
well, as we were discussing yesterday, it's extremely difficult to say what Neoplatonism is, and therefore to say this is or is not something which could be accommodated in Neoplatonism. But I took to take that version of Neoplatonism, which is like the Plotinian version, in which there is this emanation and progressive loss of goodness until we hit matter, which is conceived as the end of this metaphysical chain, because there is no goodness left. And it seems to me that the Christian doctrine of creation, creation ex nihilo, is a point in which the Christian doctor amends in a very significant way that picture of Platonism.
Well, then I guess I want to just understand what the difference is, because as far as I understand it, for a number, and I'm not sure that this affects your argument that much about Leibniz, but I think it does in terms of the tradition. For those philosophers who are Christians and embrace a creation story consistent with Genesis, or creation as ex nihilo, and yet also then describe the process of creating creatures. So God decides to create, and then creatures are created by means of emanation. There are plenty of people like that.
Yeah, but so there is a difference between saying that God decides to create and saying that the creation is ex nihilo. In any case, I would need to look at those philosophers, how they make consistent the creation ex nihilo, which is what is at issue here, and emanation. Right. So that's something.
Well, maybe we can just talk about this later. But if it is true, I mean, it is true that there's a number of philosophers who say that. So Plotinus would have been rolling around in his grave or something, hearing this, because obviously for him, creation follows necessarily. But the one could not create. But there's no choice. There's not even any kind of contemplation involved. But for those philosophers who do embrace the ex nihilo position and just think that Philo, God conceives of the forms, of the attributes, the ideas, the divine mind, and then creates by emanation based on those paradigms. That, it seems to me, sets a different kind of background to the discussion that you've presented. So, but that doesn't affect anything then.
Well, as I said, I would be inclined to say that this is one of those points in which there is a real bending from a certain model.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's thank the speakers.